Imagine this. It's 1862, and one of Karl Marx's closest collaborators publishes a book. But it's not about international worker revolution. No, it's the intellectual blueprint for a nationalist movement. That sounds totally backward, right? Well, the book was Rome and Jerusalem, and its author, Moses Hess, was one of the most fascinating and frankly surprising thinkers of the 19th century.
Now that is some seriously high praise, and it comes from Theodor Herzl, the guy we all know as the father of modern political Zionism. For Herzl himself to say that his entire project was already laid out in Hess's work, will that tell you just how foundational, and maybe how overlooked this book really is?
So who was this guy, Moses Hess? He was, in a word, a walking contradiction. He was one of the first apostles of European Socialism, a friend and collaborator of Karl Marx himself, and yet the great philosopher Martin Buber would later call him the initiator of the Zionist movement. How on earth can one person be both?
To really get Hess, you kind of have to put him side by side with his more famous collaborator, Karl Marx. They were both there at the beginning of socialism, sure, but they split on a really fundamental level. You know, Marx saw history as this clash of social classes. That's his whole dialectical materialism thing. Hess, on the other hand, was all about what he called a spiritual socialism. For him, the national bond was this deep, primary force. For Marx, it was just something to get over on the way to international solidarity.
And this break from the standard Marxist playbook is absolutely key. Hess came to believe that you couldn't just tell people to forget their national identity. He argued that these bonds of peoplehood, what he called race and nation, were real, powerful forces that you had to deal with first, before you could even get to class issues. And that belief sent him down a completely different intellectual path.
Okay, so what problem was Hess even trying to solve? Let's zoom into 19th century Germany. For years, the promise made to Jewish people was basically this. If you assimilate, if you become more German and shed your own distinct identity, you'll be accepted. Simple, right? Except it wasn't working.
And that was the huge dilemma facing assimilated German Jews. People just like Hess. I mean, they'd embraced German culture, they'd played down their own heritage, and yet they were still on the outside looking in. So if becoming more German wasn't the answer, then what in the world was?
Hess's diagnosis was, well, it was unflinching. He wrote, "The Germans hate the religion of the Jews less than their race." He basically concluded that the hatred wasn't really about religious beliefs anymore. It was about what people in the 19th century called race, an identity you couldn't change. And if that's true, then changing your religion or reforming it was never going to solve the problem.
For Hess, a huge turning point was the Damascus affair back in 1840. This was an ugly medieval lie, the blood libel, the accusation that Jews murder Christians for their blood. And suddenly it was being revived and believed by supposedly modern people. This just shocked Hess to his core. It made him realize that no matter how enlightened he was, he belonged to a slandered people, and there was no individual escape from that. This realization pushed Hess towards his most radical idea, one that put him in direct conflict with the very Marxist theories he had helped create.
He came up with this idea that the real engine of history wasn't the class struggle, but the race struggle. Now, he meant this in the 19th century sense of conflict between nations or peoples. He argued that everything, social institutions, the way we see the world, was fundamentally a racial creation, and that this clash between nations came before everything else.
So yeah, Hess completely flipped the Marxist script. He created this new hierarchy of struggle. Step 1, the primary fight, was the race struggle, the antagonism between nations. Only after you solve that, only after every people has their own place and their own national dignity, can you move on to step 2, the class struggle.
This led Hess to completely rethink his own Jewish identity. He made this incredible declaration: the Jewish religion is primarily Jewish patriotism. He was saying that Judaism isn't just a set of beliefs you can choose to leave behind. It's an unbreakable nationality, a people tied together by a shared history and a destiny that was connected to a specific ancestral land.
So, if that's the diagnosis, what was Hess's prescription? Well, in Rome and Jerusalem, he didn't just point out the problem, he laid out a vision for the future that was as practical as it was prophetic.
He called for a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine, but this wasn't just about going back to an old land. This is where he brought his socialist ideas back into the picture. He pictured a brand new society founded on what he called Mosaic or socialist principles. Think things like collective land ownership, social justice, all rooted in ancient Jewish law. It was about building a truly just society on that old ancestral soil.
And Hess didn't just stop at the big ideas. He actually laid out a concrete, nuts and bolts plan for how to do this. He said, let's create societies to purchase land. Let's start agricultural schools to train a new generation of farmers. Let's support our own laborers. And yes, let's even organize for our own protection. This wasn't some vague dream. It was a practical how-to guide for building a nation.
Now, when Hess published his book in 1862, he was pretty much ignored. He was a lonely voice crying out in the wilderness. But his ideas, they didn't die. They were like a seed that about 35 years later would explode into a global political movement.
The philosopher Martin Buber really put it best. He said, Hess wasn't just a precursor, one of many people who came before. No, Buber said he was its initiator. He was the one who first took all these threads and wove them together into the coherent modern idea of political Zionism.
So let's just be clear about this. Decades before Theodor Herzl was organizing the first Zionist Congress, decades before the movement even had its name, a socialist collaborator of Karl Marx had already written the entire playbook. Moses Hess was the forgotten prophet whose lonely words literally became the blueprint for a nation.
And this whole story leaves us with a really fascinating question for our own time. Hess's vision was for a socialist nation. It was this wild fusion of universal economic ideals and a very particular national identity. In a world where we usually see nationalism and socialism as polar opposites, how does a figure like Hess challenge our neat little political boxes and maybe force us to rethink the very nature of identity and justice?